Yeah, so my presentation is on cyclones, three case studies where cyclones hit in the southwest Indian Ocean. So whereas Aisha was looking in part at the cyclone belt in the northern part of the Indian Ocean, I'm looking at the cyclone belt in the south. This is the area here around the Mascarene Islands to the east of Madagascar. And then Madagascar, particularly, I'm looking at a case study in Tamatave, the main port on the northeast coast, and then Zanzibar on the East African coast. So if we look at the cyclone zones in terms of hazards, there are two clear zones, one in the north part of the Pacific, hitting Asia, and then carrying through into the Bay of Bengal, and then further towards the Persian Gulf, and then the southern zone, which hits Australia, crosses the southern part of the Indian Ocean, and hits Madagascar and East Africa. And recently, of course, there's an increasing tendency for it to hit East Africa. So this is a graphic portrayal of cyclone tracks between 1980 and 2005. And if we look at the historical cyclone damage criteria, then we have meteorological details, people, livestock, infrastructure, buildings, plantations, state of the sea, ships, landscape, trees, surge, power and water, social and economic consequences. In part, we'll be looking at this, but one of the problems in looking at past case studies is that most of them come from European and therefore Eurocentric portrayals. And what I've tried to do is to also look to try to sort of discern the impact on indigenous communities and the hazards that they undergo. If we look at the 50-year distribution category, then it's quite interesting because the 19th century, in fact, shows less damage than the 18th and far less damage than the modern era in terms of its impacts. Again, in terms of human adaptation to cyclones, which is critical, in other words, the learning process of how to survive cyclones in the immediate aftermath and then developing strategies of resilience and adaptation. The general pattern in the past from my case studies is that house dwellers flee. They seek shelter in the forest or in the hills and mountains. Obviously, they nail down the boards and shutters of windows. They replace palm leaf and straw roofs with wooden shingles. That was particularly the case in the Mascarene Islands. Fishermen are a particular case in the sense that they have centuries of contact with cyclone risks, and there are detailed patterns observing the approach of cyclones through sea foam, sky, and the general reaction is to pull boats inland as far as possible from the sea. This works with the smaller boats. Farmers, planters, sometimes we see an adaptation, in other words, the adoption of new plants. For example, after the 1806-7 cyclones with floods in the Mascarenes, planters switched to sugarcane, a more resistant crop than a traditional sort of array of crops. And then community alarms. Again, looking to the Mascarenes, ports raise the flag, fire 2 cannon shot, and church bells raise alarms. Only from the latter part of the 19th century do we get increased meteorological measurements and enhanced regional communications, which can give advance warnings. You probably noted on the 4th of May that there was what was advertised in some of the media as the first ever cyclone threat to the Kenyan coast, hitting Tanzania as well. In fact, one of the most notable cyclones to hit Zanzibar was in 1872, and that's one I'm going to look at now. And we have an engraving that indicates some of the damage done in Stonetown. And it went on to hit the East African coast. If we look at the impact, it destroyed clove plantations, coconut trees, shipping, including the Sultan's warships. It destroyed Zanzibar town, and there were many deaths, particularly in the slave labor force, which forced slave prices up sharply. This is an eyewitness account, but I want to move on to one where we say, this is a European one, an American one, saying, until we sailed out of Zanzibar, we all had the idea that the native stories of destruction were overdrawn, but in sailing by the place, we felt they were not. It goes on to describe the trees that were decimated, and then a curious description that the grass was scorched and yellow as if a blast of fire had swept over it, despite the 6 weeks of constant rain that had preceded it. And then a description from sail from Zanzibar, the hurricane had made on the beach. The spectacle was terrible. Goods, specie, debris of boats were scattered along the shore. A moderate estimate of loss puts it at 500,000. That at the Chambers is still greater. If we move to our second case study, so that was 1872. We're now moving to 1892 and to the island of Mauritius, to the northeast of Madagascar. And this is the cyclone trajectory. Mauritius is frequently hit between the months of November, late November and April by cyclones. And many of these cyclones go on to hit Madagascar, which forms the following case study. But the 1892 one was the fourth deadliest cyclone in the southern hemisphere prior to 2019, or recorded one. A minimum of 1,200 people died, 4,000 injured, 6 villages destroyed, 50,000 left homeless, 30 of the island's 50 churches destroyed, enormous damage done to the barges in the harbour, 75% of the island's sugar production facilities destroyed. So this is the one resilient crop. 200,000 trees knocked down, damage estimated at 2 million, and soldiers patrolling social and economic consequences, immediate consequences. So soldiers patrolled the streets of the capital to prevent looting. And these are some of the images of the destruction. These are obviously photographs. And the Commercial Gazette, in less than 6 hours, it has been completely annihilated. Annihilated to such a degree that it is really doubtful whether it will ever recover from the blow. And there are quite vivid descriptions. There's not a Mauritian family, but is in mourning, not a family which is not ruined. Again, a picture of the cyclone damage, the Grand River Railway dialect, the destruction of the dialect, collecting clothes for cyclone victims, Poivre Street. And one of in describing the devastation, there were, of course, some of the reasons put forward for the lack of preparedness. And one of them was that there was a kind of memory slide. In other words, that the community had forgotten previous cyclones despite the regularity of cyclones hitting it. And particularly in the season between the 12th of April and the 1st of December, so out of the regular cyclone season. People relaxed. They were not as prepared to meet the cyclone. And with the calm of the storm for 4 hours, so the height of the storm, the calm of the storm, people relaxed. They came out of their houses, and they weren't prepared for the subsequent second bout of the cyclone. And then many were just simply tired of being shut up for hours and opened all their windows and doors, thus making them vulnerable to the cyclone. So if we move on now to the third case study, which is that of Tamatave in 1927, the French captured Madagascar, made it a colony in 1895, and most of the descriptions come from French colonial archives, and most of the descriptions were, of course, being French and French colonial, were concentrated upon the damage done to the colonial infrastructure. Now, Tamatave, just to explain the background, Tamatave is critical to the French colonial experience in Madagascar. It's the chief port. It's on the northeast coast. And the French spent much of their time from 1895 building a railway line from Antananarivo, which is the capital in the high interior of the country, down to Tamatave on the northeast coast. So in Tamatave, they're trying to build an infrastructure which is dealing with most of the imports and exports, hence the significance of a cyclone which damages this. Here we see some of the, before 1895, Tamatave was a small port town where fishermen and sailors lived on the Pointe Asti, where the boats anchored. What the French did was they pushed them off, and they started building up sanitation works, a stone surface. They enlarged a wharf for ships to come in, put in some electricity, telegraphic communications, for example, from 1910 to signal the advent of cyclones, and of course the railway line, the critical, what they considered to be the critical communications between Antananarivo in the center and the main port. And 1925, a 20-meter long, 3-meter wide pier was completed for passenger connections to ships. This is the precise route of the cyclone. So it first veered towards La Réunion, the Mascarene Islands, and then sharply towards the east coast and hit Tamatave, and then crossed the island, emerging in the Mozambique Channel. It was an abnormal cyclone, signaled from the 25th of February at Mauritius, and it's abnormal in the sense that it turned rapidly towards the east coast and was accompanied by a tidal surge. On the 3rd of March, it hit Tamatave, 8:30 a.m., vivid descriptions, the tin and tile roofs started to fly off. 9 a.m., a wall of rain fell, total reduction of vision, ship's anchors loosen, ships drift, then a surge into the town itself. 80% of the town buildings are destroyed, and one of the rare instances of a notice of largely indigenous deaths, over 600. Very few Europeans died, but over 600 deaths. These were mainly Malagasy. And here we have a visual image of the destruction along the coastline. This is the railway line heading towards the port. The ruins of a church, and a ship that's turned over in the bay. Now, what was the result of this? It swept away almost all existing structures in the port, but this pushed authorities into hiring a Franco-German consortium to complete, by August 1934, a protected deep harbor port that could harbor large ships, and by January 1936 support warehouses and electric and water supplies. So in the sense, that particular cyclone pushed the colonial authorities into a far greater investment in infrastructure than they would otherwise have done. Okay, thanks very much.